Hey, everybody, welcome to Reckoning with Jason Herbert. I am, of course, Jason Herbert, and we're talking today about the Cuban Missile Crisis, talking with the amazing Dr. Renata Keller. She is a professor of history over at the University of Nevada, Reno. She just wrote a new book called The Fate of the Americas, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Hemispheric Cold War, and we're talking today about the Kevin Costner film, 13 Days. It's an absolutely amazing film if you haven't seen it, and if you have seen it, we're going to break it down and talk about the world around Cuba and around the United States and how Latin America responds to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So get ready, because Reckoning with Jason Herbert starts right now. My name is Jason Herbert. I'm a Southerner who lives in the West. I'm a historian, an outdoorsman, and a movie buff. I like finding new answers to old questions, and this is a reckoning. I've been watching this book in development for the longest time. So I'm close with UNC Press and all the folks over there. They send me like an ungodly amount of books to come on the pod. And when I saw your book, initially, I was like, ooh, because it's well known about my love of Cuban coffee and everything else at this point in time. But I immediately saw this book. I was like, 13 Days, which is this movie that I actually love. But I don't know if I should love it or not, because that's the reason why I want to talk to you about it. So I'm watching this. I'm like, am I a fool if I like this movie?
No.
Or not? So, I think this movie's terrifying. So, anyway, long story. I am so excited to talk to you, because when I first saw this, I was like, hey, you should come on the pod. It was like 9 months ago. It was just waiting impatiently to get my hands on this here book, which I have here. Yes. And I took your book, and I was very cautious at first, and I didn't want to mess with it because it's so pretty. And then I started highlighting the crap out of it. So, which I thought was like the highest compliment I could give.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's what I had to tell myself, of like, it's okay to use.
Yes, please.
Okay. Yes, exactly. So if you're listening in right now, mark up your books. It's the highest compliment you can give an author, right? Is to just completely just destroy the thing, correct?
Oh, yeah. All the marginalia.
All right. So I'm so excited to talk. This is our first conversation.
It is, yeah.
Like we're friends on socials and stuff like that, but it's the first time we've ever actually talked. So, you want to introduce yourself to the audience, and actually me, and tell us who you are and what you're doing?
So my name is Renata Keller, and I'm a professor of modern Latin America and the Cold War. And so that's why it makes sense that I wrote this book. My first book was about Mexican-Cuban-U.S. relations in the 1960s and 70s. It was called Mexico's Cold War. And this is my second book, The Fate of the Americas, the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Hemispheric Cold War. Titles are always fun. We can talk titles if you want.
I definitely want to talk titles, but go on.
Oh, yeah. So, and I am a professor at the University of Nevada, Reno.
Terrific school. I want to ask you, though, so this is your second book. Obviously, Cuba plays a huge part in this. Mexico plays a huge part in this. What drew you initially into writing about Mexico, Cuba, Cold War? How did you get sucked into this? What was the deal?
Yeah. Let's see. So I was in graduate school, and I already knew I was interested in Latin America and the Cold War. I've been interested in that for a long time. I don't really know why. I studied abroad in Chile, and it was maybe the 30th anniversary of the coup, I want to say, when I was there.
You wrote about happy things, but you're just hey, here's the downfall of another society. But yes, okay.
Exactly. And I needed to write a research paper, and I was looking on the National Security Archives website, because I love their website. And they had a couple of articles by Kate Doyle about Mexican-Cuban relations and Mexico's kind of exceptional policy toward Cuba after the Cuban Revolution. I thought, well, that's fascinating. And I had the Lyndon B. Johnson Library. It was right there. I went to University of Texas in Austin, where they have the LBJ Library. And so I thought, well, I can look at these documents about Mexico and Cuba in the LBJ Library, for this semester, this term paper. And then I can go to Mexico and see what they have there. And it just kind of ballooned from there to this project about Mexico's kind of weird embrace of Cuba, but then the effect that the Cuban Revolution had on domestic politics in Mexico and Mexico's relations with the United States and how all of those were connected.
One of the things I think about whenever I think about in terms of this era, I always think about United States, Soviet Union, Cuba, in this convenient little triangle in my head. And I get so focused on the relationship between Khrushchev, Kennedy, Castro. And then I tend to it's almost like I get these blinders on, Renata, where I'm like, I forget that the rest of the Caribbean exists. Like what will happen if there's a war there, or like Central and South America. Like and then I'm reading this book, I'm like, oh, duh, there are other people in the world,
I had that moment too.
I mean, that was really as well. I was like, oh yeah, Bolivia happens to exist. Duh. There are people there who are very vested in what happens here. But I wanted to ask you, like you say this early in your book, like, why do we need like another book? You say, I think I want to quote, you said there were approximately 764 million books on the Cuban Missile Crisis. Like, were you intimidated by the ideas? Like, really, do I have something new to say here? Like what's that process like for you?
It was really intimidating. When I started researching this, I did a search on WorldCat, and there are over 3,000 books on the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Oh my gosh.
That's a lot. And so I did ask myself, like, do we need another? But then I was doing the research and finding things that I didn't know, that I didn't see in any of these other books. And I was learning so much. And I thought, I mean, it was this kind of eye-opening, like, wait a minute, this does affect other people. I had looked at Mexico and the Cuban Missile Crisis in my first book and learned a lot by doing that. And then someone asked me, what about the rest of Latin America? And I assumed that other people had written about that because there are 3,000 books. But no, I was shocked that there were so little about reactions in other parts of Latin America to this major world event happening in their own backyard that would directly affect them. And so I thought, it's weird. I'm not a Cuban Missile Crisis expert. Those people exist. When I started out, I didn't think of myself that way, but I thought, you know what, I do have new things to say, and I think they're interesting, and I can become a missile crisis expert. There is room for me too in this conversation.
Well, I think one of the questions you're saying this now is like, I'm kind of curious now, like what about the Spanish sources, like the Spanish speaking and writing authors? There are other historians elsewhere. So was this not drawing attention out of scholars out of Mexico or Argentina or other places like that either?
Not much.
Really?
There was very little. There would be mentions in passing, but a lot of the literature that's produced in Latin America tends to be very nationally bounded. And so they will look at like their national history or their relations with the United States. But there doesn't, until recently, there hasn't been much work that is transnational or even looking at relations between Latin American countries that don't involve the United States. And so I found some mentions in passing about, there were a couple works about Argentina that mention the Cuban Missile Crisis. There were a couple of works in Portuguese about Brazil that mention the Cuban Missile Crisis. There were 2 articles by Jim Hirschberg published in Cold War History where he looked in really great detail at Brazil and the unique role that Brazil played. But other than that, there wasn't much. Like, you look at memoirs and it shows up, but if looking at secondary sources and historical accounts, I was also, again, like, really shocked because I assumed it would be there and it wasn't.
Yeah. Now I'm just like screaming to graduate students in my head. I'm like, this is your prompt. Like, get down to the art. Like, not that I have to sell graduate students on going down to Argentina or Chile or someplace, but go to La Paz. Go someplace down there. But speaking
that
of
was students, my excuse too.
Yeah, I mean, that was the other question. Like, did you just choose this because you wanted to go to the archives in all of these places? I mean, because I wouldn't blame you. I feel bad for people who are like, I'm going to I study, whatever, someplace cold.
Yes, that was a big part of my motivation. I studied abroad, like I mentioned, in Chile. I lived in Argentina for a year before I started graduate school. I've traveled to Mexico, and I've always just enjoyed like living and at least visiting other parts of Latin America. And so this was, to a large extent, an excuse to get to know other parts of Latin America and their histories. hadn't read much about Panamanian history, for example, or Venezuelan history before I started this project. And so it was a way to get to know different places and different histories. That was part of the motivation when I started. It turned out to be harder than I thought. Zika happened when I was starting this project, and that limited my research opportunities.
Yeah, you had a lot of fun with this. Like Zika, you've got COVID. Like you have, like, are you to blame for you need to write like an environmental history of your own work at this point in time, like or things I caused while writing a history. So, was that a challenge? Like, because as I started to like conceptualize Central, South America, the Greater Caribbean, these are a lot of spaces. Was there ever a time when you were thinking about this project going, wait, this has the capacity to get like too out of hand or too big, or, because this is a very nice, tight book, coming in. It's like, and it's got a real great focus to it. But I'm wondering, was that part like daunting where you're like, I need to visit all these places. I need to like, I'm here in Chile, but I need to go over to Bolivia or Panama or like, what's that like for you as a scholar thinking about, how do I keep this compact and tell the story that I can find here?
Yeah, it was challenging because there's limitations of time, there's limitations of money. It took me more than 10 years to write this book. And if I had included everywhere I wanted to go and everything I wanted to include, I don't think I ever would have gotten it out. For example, Canada, I really wanted to include Canada. But there has been really good work done on Canada and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I decided to limit it to OAS countries as kind of a logical way to separate out, like, would I include the French Caribbean? What about the British Caribbean?
Right. Not that you don't want to go to Martinique or something.
I know. I'd so badly want to go there. But again, time, money, efficiency. So I did decide to limit it to countries in the Organization of American States. And I think it worked, but it did make me sad to not go all those other wonderful places. And so I think other grad students can do that.
Okay, like so, I'm sitting here patting myself on the back for having the epiphany that there are other places in the world. Like I was reading your book, and then I forgot about Canada until you said that. I was like, oh, maybe they were also watching this, Yes. It's like things that happen to America mannered. I'm such a bad scholar. Let me ask you this. You teach over at University of Nevada, Reno, undergraduates, graduate students, like, and I'm kind of wondering, the students who come into your class courses on, say, Cold War or something like that, what's the knowledge level like for students walking into your class? Are they familiar at all with the Cuban Missile Crisis? Are they broadly, like, what's your experience as far as like what people know when they enter your course?
Yes, they all have a basic knowledge. I think it is part of the like curriculum for high school students here. And I think also in many other parts of the country, it's one of the topics that people have a reasonable familiarity with. I wouldn't say a lot of knowledge, not very deep knowledge, but they do know. I've asked students actually at the beginning of classes, what do you know about the Cuban Missile Crisis? And they'll say they know Kennedy, Khrushchev, missiles in Cuba. That's about it. Like they can name two, maybe three of the people involved. They know that it happened in Cuba because of the name. They know that it didn't end a nuclear war.
Also
but
good.
That's about it.
Well, at least there's something there, and it's it's a little bit different. I'm Gen X, right? I was born in '77, so I kind of grew up actually towards the tail end of the Cold War. I think for you and me, Cold War is still very much part of our life as we grew up, and actually, it really wasn't that far removed. Now that I'm into my 40s, like it's just the timeline wasn't that far away. Growing up in the 80s, I mean, 1962 is just like it's a stone's throw. So I also understand challenges for young people now who are Gen Alpha, Gen Z. I don't know where they're at. I don't know what the terms are. And so I'm not the person to heckle them for saying, why don't you know this? Because I often feel, I don't know about you, but like I look at American history now, the way we teach it, and I say 2 semesters are breaking this up like pre and post Civil War. I don't think there's enough time, Renata. I feel like we need like
for the post part,
right? I mean, even if we could teach like a post World War II or post Depression or something like that, like something. I don't feel like there was enough time. When I was teaching high school, I could barely get to Reagan. I would feel like that was a victory.
That's where my high school class stopped, was Reagan.
Yeah, and then that's when things got really weird. But I wanted to ask you, have you seen, so we're talking about 13 Days. This is a film that I have, we've been doing the watch party on HATM every Sunday night for over 7 years now. I have yet to be able to get this film in front of people because it just hasn't been available. And I've always wanted to do so because it's one of those straight up, like, this is a history film, right?
Yeah.
Had you seen this before? Like we scheduled this? Were you familiar with this movie at all? Like, what are your general impressions of this movie?
I like it. I think it's great. I had seen it before, and I am teaching a whole class on the Cuban Revolution this semester.
Oh.
I know. It's lovely.
Are you teaching them how to make Cuban coffee? You know I have a thing. I'm just saying.
I should, but I don't know. I don't drink coffee.
I will zoom in. I will do this. Anyway, keep going.
Yes. And so I did assigned this movie. We were able to get it through the library streaming service. So I've seen it a couple times, and I think it's great. I think I really like the way that they use like historical transcripts to really bring you into the drama of the moment and to make it like almost this. It's not a primary source, but they use primary sources in such an amazing way, and I think they did an incredible job of it's not a documentary, but it's a drama, and it's scary. Like every time I watch it, I get really invested in the outcome, even though I know what it is.
Yeah, this movie's kind of, like I said, I feel like this movie is terrifying. And there's actually a documentary that I keep thinking of whenever I watch this, which is The Fog of War, Robert McNamara. You're familiar with this one?
Yeah.
That's even scarier when I watch that, because I'm like, the things that he reveals about talking to Castro after the fact, I'm like, holy cow. Like, we really were on the brink here of this thing. So for people listening in, let's dive into the film here a little bit. We'll kind of interject from the film a little bit to your book and kind of pull out maybe this broader picture of what's going on. This movie kind of starts in with this discovery of missiles in Cuba, right? It's like really kind of the kicking off point of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I get that. But then I read your book and I'm like, wait a second, the Cuban Missile Crisis really happened a lot earlier. And you kind of point to point to January 1, 1959, or actually you start even before then with Fulgencio Batista. You want to talk about let's talk about the Cuban Revolution and how that kind of builds up to what happens in October 62.
Yeah, let's do it. And so that was actually something I struggled with when I was writing the book, where to start. Like we always do, like, where do we start our stories?
Oh my gosh. In the beginning.
My first draft. Yeah, I started with the Monroe Doctrine in the
It was a dark and stormy night in Havana.
I know. I went back too far at first. But
really?
I did. Yeah, my first draft is I was talking about the Monroe Doctrine. And then I was
gosh.
like, I'm never going to get to the missile crisis of this. And so I do start with Cuba's war for independence from Spain and U.S. intervention in that war. That's where I landed on, because it introduces this idea of sovereignty and the way that even once they became independent, at the beginning of the 20th century, Cuba always had this uneven relationship with the United States, in which the United States dominated Cuba's economy, its politics, its social scene in a lot of ways. And so the Cuban Revolution was in part a reaction, and a large part a reaction against Fulgencio Batista and this US-backed dictator that they had in the 1950s. But it was also a very nationalist revolution. And it was about also regaining their denied independence and sovereignty that they had sought, way back in the 19th century. And so, the Cuban Revolution was a fight to unseat Batista. A lot of different groups participated in the Cuban Revolution. The July 26 movement was one of them, and it was one of the most prominent ones. That's the one that Fidel Castro led, along with his brother and Che Guevara and various other people. And they eventually were able to, both by fighting in the mountains, the famous like guerrillas in the mountains, but also there was a lot of urban insurrection as well. And so there was this widespread effort to unseat Fulgencio Batista, and it succeeded. And so Batista fled Cuba on January 1st, 1959. and Castro was able to declare himself the winner, or the leader of the Cuban Revolution, and the July 26th movement took over the Cuban government and started instituting all of these reforms. It was very ambitious, much more ambitious than a lot of revolutions that had happened before. And it was really, I mean, at first, everyone in Latin America was very excited about it because they had overthrown this tyrant. Batista had become
Batista's not a good dude.
Yeah, not a good dude at all. And so at first, everyone's very excited, and it's a very popular revolution across Latin America and also in the United States. It was exciting for a lot of people. But then pretty soon, because of all of these ambitious reforms that they wanted to undertake, like things like land reform, property, all kinds of stuff, that they realized that those would bring them into conflict with the United States. And so the Cubans started turning toward the Soviet Union for aid and trade, and eventually for protection once things really escalated with the United States. And so I talk about kind of this growing relationship with the Soviet Union, and then how people in Latin America responded to the radicalization of the Cuban Revolution. And some people were super excited still, and some people said, this is what we need in our own countries. We need land reform. We need, to get our own dictators out of power. We need guerrilla movements like the Cubans had. And so you start to see other guerrilla movements popping up all over Latin America. But on the other hand, a lot of people are saying they're turning communist. And
there's this happening, right?
Yeah, exactly. They're inviting the Soviet Union in. They're seizing land from people. They're seizing people's bank accounts. They are certainly not democratic like they promised they would be. And so you also get a lot of people across Latin America saying, this isn't what we want. We don't want this in our own countries. And we should help out the Cubans who've had their revolution hijacked. So it's really divisive. And that's part of what I'm trying to say in the book, is that Latin Americans responded really strongly to the Cuban Revolution. And that's part of what caused the Cuban Missile Crisis, this very strong response across the political spectrum in Latin America. And this eventually led to the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, to kicking Cuba out of the Organization of American States that same year. And so they really the Cubans started to feel isolated and under attack. And Khrushchev, watching in Moscow, is also seeing, they're under attack. They're being invaded. And so that sends the message that Cuba is in danger, and the Cuban government's in danger, and they need help.
We should probably talk about the Bay of Pigs now. You just brought this up because because we hear the term Bay of Pigs about 75 times in this film. The Bay of Pigs looms large over the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think one of the things that this film does really well is talk. I mean, it's like these guys are really licking their wounds from Bay of Pigs. Do you want to talk a little bit about what Bay of Pigs was for people who are maybe not as? I don't want to assume that people know a whole lot about Bay of Pigs or about this era. So, you want to talk a little bit about what kind of disaster the Bay of Pigs was for the United States, and like how that affects like their relationships with the Soviet Union, because Khrushchev's like thinking this is fantastic afterward. I mean, because it's a real win for him after. So
it's a disaster for Kennedy. So it's the Bay of Pigs invasion started being planned under Eisenhower in 1960 with the cooperation of some Central American governments, the governments of Guatemala, Nicaragua, Panama. They provided training areas, they provided kind of ports and airspaces. And so they start this process of training Cuban exiles, recruiting Cuban exiles, and many of them were in the United States, but a lot of these Cuban exiles are also across Latin America. They gather first in Panama and then in Guatemala to get trained by the CIA. And it's supposed to be a secret, but it's not. Like, by November 1960, there's reports in the New York Times, there's reports in the Guatemalan papers that they're planning this operation. The Cubans are well aware of what's going on. They have their own spies, within the exile groups. And so everyone knows this invasion's coming. And then it actually starts with air attacks in in April 1961, and they're U.S. pilots who are pretending not to be. And they bomb Cuba's air defenses, and they don't do a very good job. They only wipe out about half at most of Cuba's air defenses. And then a few days after that, they send in Brigade 2506, which is this, I think, 1,500 or so person force of Cuban exiles. Mm-hmm. And it's a huge disaster. Cuba's Air Force is still able to like bomb the ships that come in. They land and there's coral reefs, so they have trouble like getting out of the ships. It's supposed to be a surprise, but they like arriving at night and start shooting at people, and so everyone knows what's going on. So it's not a surprise, and they don't get the reinforcements that they were hoping for from Kennedy, which is very controversial. Kennedy gets a lot of criticism for kind of abandoning this brigade at the Bay of Pigs, and Latin American leaders in Central America are pushing him. The Nicaragua, Somoza in Nicaragua, saying like, "Let us go! Like, let our air forces go in. We just need to refuel in the United States." And Kennedy like denies them that. And within a couple of days, the Cuban forces wipe out the invasion and take a lot of prisoners. And they were able to do so in part because the Soviet Union had already sent a lot of weaponry, like tanks, guns, all kinds of stuff, right before the invasion. And so in some cases, like people were learning how to drive the tanks on the way to the Bay of Pigs. But it did come in time for the Cubans to defend themselves. It was a very like David versus Goliath victory for the Cubans. And it helped consolidate Castro's rule at home. They rounded up a bunch of people who could have potentially cooperated with the invasion. They rounded them up and they put them in jail. And it was a big boost in morale for the Cubans at that point. It made them look great on the international stage for defending their country against a U.S.-led invasion. And so this was a huge win for Castro and a huge loss for Kennedy. And Kennedy was furious that he had been kind of pressured into accepting or greenlighting this invasion that had been planned under Eisenhower. And he regretted that he had let himself be pressured into doing it. He regretted that he had, listened to the advice of people, especially in the CIA, who had promised that it would be easy and quick. And so it really shaped how he responded to the missile crisis, and it helped cause the missile crisis. So it was really important. If you need to understand the Cuban Missile Crisis, you need to understand the Bay of Pigs invasion.
Yeah, and we see that real tension, in the film when, Kennedy, when JFK, his brother Bobby, Kenny O'Donnell, as well, like with who is it, Maxwell Taylor and Bombs Way LeMay are trying to push and push, and all these guys are trying to push these guys, and you can feel that real tension of like, we're not going to do this again. Like it's I mean, with that understanding of like, this is what happened last time. He seems like he really took a beating there. Maybe it was just I don't know, Renata, was it a sign of Kennedy's inexperience as a young commander in chief, as a young leader? He got outplayed here.
I think so. I think, he entered office 3 months before the invasion. And he was told by people who he respected, like Eisenhower, that, this is our best chance to remove Castro. He was told by people with way more military experience than he did that, this had a good chance of succeeding. And so I think he was outplayed, but it's understandable. He was new to this, and he was trusting people who had a lot more experience than he had. And so you can understand why he did it, but also why he was very hesitant to fall for that again.
I want to say the name Kevin Costner for the very first time. We're half an hour into this podcast now. We haven't even talked about Kevin Costner, who apparently is in this movie.
Yeah.
I really liked how they kind of framed this film through his perspective here. I had never heard of Kenny O'Donnell before seeing this film. Like, I had no idea who he was. He doesn't show up. Like, he's not a Kennedy. He's not McNamara. He's not one of these other guys. What do we know about Kenny O'Donnell? Was he really that close to the brothers? Looking back on this, like he still doesn't get romanticized or told about it.
No.
And he's got this kind of tragic story that happens afterwards. But like, what do we know about this guy?
So he was really close to the Kennedy brothers. He was a college roommate of Robert Kennedy at Harvard, and they played on the football team together. And then he helped run John Kennedy's campaigns. And so he was really close to them. It's funny because he's not, I think it's fair that he was really close to them and really influential. But if you look at the transcripts of the XCOM committee meetings, he says like 2 sentences. So it's understandable that he wouldn't make it into the history books of the crisis. But I think if you look at the history of the Kennedys overall, you can see why he was there in the room, even if he wasn't, participating very vocally. And so I think that is interesting because in the transcripts that we have, because John F. Kennedy was secretly recording a lot of the meetings of the XCOM. And we have those, and it's an amazing source. I know, I love him so much. His little historian's heart was like, I'm preserving this for
my little historian heart is very happy about this.
Yes. And in those, O'Donnell doesn't show up very much. He's noted as being in the room, but he's not saying a lot. But then you watch the movie and you're like, well, but maybe he was there and doing some nonverbal communication that was also important that you don't end up seeing in the tapes, but could have still been influential. And that part we just don't know, right? We can look at people's memoirs. He's not mentioned that much in other people's memoirs. He has his own memoir. So there are other sources, but again, it's hard for visual things, we as historians are somewhat limited in understanding that.
I kind of dig this though as a teaching moment for our students though, because when people barely show up in the archives, often women, in my own, in my own field and stuff like that, it's like, but we know they're there. So you're having to imagine, and I think this film does this really cool job of saying, okay, he's not talking a lot in these rooms. He's clearly talking elsewhere, and there's a reason he's there.
Yeah.
Whether it's just like to provide like this kind of like a support for JFK as he's pushing back on some of these other leaders or things like that, or just to listen in and confer, later on. It's the thing of, talking to students of history is like, there's who's in the room, who's why, what don't we know here? I dig how they're imagining this, through his perspective. What about the other portrayals? I love Costner in this film. This is one of my favorite Costner performances. And I'm thinking about this in terms of like, wait a second, he does a Boston accent in this, but he can't do the Robin Hood thing. Whatever, it's fine. I know,
Robin Hood. I liked his Boston accent. I mean, it's over the top, but like, so are Boston accents.
Right?
Like, they kind of are. And I think that's fine. And he's, leaning into the character. And, Bobby has his own Boston accent. And so I didn't mind that. I have seen criticism of that, but I thought it, people from Boston, especially if they grew up there,
they sound like
a lot of them have accents, and that's fine.
Well, it's almost forgivable that people might overdo the Boston accent because often, as a native Southerner myself, when I hear people come and do like Southern accents in films, it's just nails on a chalkboard because it's never that pronounced. There are subtleties to a Southern accent. I hide my accent most times, and then I just let it out when I'm talking to mom. But the portrayals in this film, like, I'm a massive Bruce Greenwood fanboy. Like, he's got that gravitas. So, like, he shows up, and you're like, I mean, him, Culp. Who's the guy who's playing LeMay, who I loved?
He was great. McNamara.
Oh my gosh, yeah, right.
Did you ever watch The Good Wife?
Parts. So
he's a recurring character in that show. It was a very memorable character in that role. I think he got like an Emmy or something for it. But when he showed up in the movie, I was like, oh my God, it's Colin Sweeney.
I know, right? But actually, we're talking about McNamara here. We talk a little bit about how Kenny O'Donnell doesn't show up in the archive very much, and he's got this huge role in this film. It's kind of around him. Can we talk a little bit about Robert McNamara? Because it almost feels like he's almost the inverse with this, because he's a massive player within the Kennedy and later LBJ administrations. Is he kind of sidelined in this film? We don't really see
a little
McNamara doing all. He's got the big stand down with the admiral later on.
Yeah, I love that scene.
Yeah.
John Paul Jones. But yeah, no, he is a little bit sidelined. He's not one of the major characters, I would say, in the movie. He is, I mean, like, among all of the other people who aren't Kennedys or Kenny, he does, I think, have more of a role than some of them. I think some of them are sidelined more than he was.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, he played such a big role in these conversations. If you look at the transcripts, he was all over the place, making really great points. And I think they capture that a little bit in the movie. But yeah, he was a major figure in kind of pushing for a quarantine instead of a nuclear strike, or not a nuclear strike, but an airstrike or an invasion. And I think they could have highlighted that more, but
It's
eventually
Costner's
they got
film.
there.
I
Yeah.
get it.
Yeah.
But one of the other things that we see here is this real tension. In addition to like the tension between the play, Renata, does this pick up in the does this show up in the archives where there's a tension between the Kennedy administration and all the established military leadership in there? Because it really feels like that in the film. Like there's a real distrust or a dislike on the part of the military towards the
Yeah.
Kennedys, those rich guys from Boston who think they know everything. Like, how does that show up in the archive? Like, are you picking up on that at all?
Somewhat. It is, I think, exaggerated a little in the film, this tension.
Mm-hmm.
But they were a new generation, and you do see that in the archive. And it was genuinely portrayed in the film, this idea that they were younger, that they came in, a lot of them, with advanced graduate degrees, and they're a lot brainier group than usual. And so it was a new approach to governing, and I think that probably did cause quite a bit of tension. My work has mostly been in Latin America, so I haven't looked that much at like
Mm-hmm.
inter domestic relations with Kennedy and his wider group of advisors. But even in Latin America, they're like, this is new, this is different. The Kennedy administration is not the same old business. Like, they're revolutionizing. They have their own revolution, the Alliance for Progress. It's a new way of thinking about that we need change in the world, and they are trying to pursue it instead of always preserving tradition. They are embracing change, and that does rile up some people in Latin America and in the United States.
Well, I guess that kind of segues perfectly, actually, to my question here. Kind of, if we can leap off screen, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
back to Latin America. Can you talk a little bit about how the ways, because people in Latin America are viewing the events going on in Cuba and DC and Moscow, and there's a lot at stake here between what happens in Cuba. Can you talk a little bit about the different ways in which people are seeing or reacting to what's going on during these days in October?
Yeah, and that was one of the things that surprised me the most when I started this project, was just the wide range of reactions in Latin America. I think when we think about how people in the United States responded, they all kind of rallied behind Kennedy eventually. And that was definitely not the case in Latin America. The Latin American governments did, and they voted unanimously in the Organization of American States to set up the quarantine. They show that briefly in the movie.
Mm-hmm.
So while the governments of Latin America do support the approach that Kennedy pushes for, and some of them even join the quarantine. Argentina's government sends destroyers. Venezuela's government sends destroyers. A lot of them provide like airfields or offer whatever facilities they have available. But some governments don't. And Brazil is an example of a government that says, we'll help establish the quarantine, but we are not participating in it. We are advocating for peace.
Mm-hmm.
And we will not participate in any attacks on Cuba. They abstain from other parts of the OAS resolution that approve attacks if necessary. And Brazilian officials meet with protesters, and they say, yes, we need to stand up for Cuban sovereignty, and Cuba should be allowed to determine its own fate and destiny and make their own choices. We don't necessarily agree with the choices they're making, but they should be allowed to make them. And that really upset the United States. And if you look beyond the government level, which is also a big goal of my book, was to also look at how other people were responding. You see some people agreeing with the US position and saying, like, we can't have nuclear weapons in Cuba. They're endangering everyone. Like, what if they bomb us? I found all these news reports of people in Colombia trying to figure out, so if they bomb the Panama Canal, like, are we safe? And so you do get a lot of that. You have like big marches with tens of thousands of people saying we need peace. And you get editorials in favor of the United States, but then I found tons of people who are defending Cuba and saying, Cuba has been attacked. They have the right to defend themselves, and they have the right to determine their own alliances, to determine their own policies. The United States has nuclear weapons. Why can't other countries? And so there was a really wide range of responses, and often people disagreeing with their own governments, protesting against what their own governments were doing. You see this a lot in Argentina, for example. I found this amazing collection of flyers that people were creating, and intelligence agents were busily collecting, where they were protesting that their government was risking Argentine lives to support the United States at the same time that the IMF and the United States were like strangling Argentina's economy. And they're saying, why should we support the United States? We need to keep our boys at home. They shouldn't be sailing off to Cuba to attack a fellow Latin American country. And so you do get a really wide range of responses, and some of them are pro-peace, but some of them are violent. And so you get people bombing U.S. embassies, U.S. businesses. Eventually there's a riot in Bolivia that kills 5 people. And so Latin American governments and people are really invested in the outcome. But their responses are not at all what you would expect if you just looked at the United States.
Yeah, one of the things that reading your book really reminded me of, and I'm going to give you a really bad history thing here, a guilty admission on my part, right? Because when you start to think about a certain event and think about that event only, you can kind of get the blinders on. You think about it, your book does this so well. Where I think about, the Soviet Union is intervening in Cuba, and you're like, wait a sec, the United States has a history, and these Latin American countries know this. It's the United States who has long been the primary interventionist into Latin America. And I tell you this, Renata, with a copy of Theodore Roosevelt's autobiography on my desk right now.
Perfect.
So
Exhibit A.
I know, right? These countries in Central South America, Caribbean, have had to deal with the United States' intermingling, and will frankly have to continue to deal with them for decades before and after this. So it's like you get why there's a mix here. The United States isn't necessarily the good guy that Kevin Costner would have us believe. Mm-hmm. Certainly not in these in these go-betweens.
Yeah, you sound exactly like Salvador Allende. He gave a big speech to the Chilean Congress. Yeah, or he was giving this whole history of U.S. intervention in Latin America and saying, this is what they do. Why would we side with them? Why are we suddenly agreeing with intervention and approving U.S. intervention in another Latin American country? This is their whole. This is their
shtick.
Process. Yeah, their shtick. We shouldn't be supporting this. We should be fighting it.
The easy knock on this film is like, well, we only see the American side. Well, it's still 2.5 hours long, right?
Yeah.
It's just a super deep dive into this. It's like a micro history of this moment. Can we talk a little bit about the relationship between Castro and Khrushchev? Because here's the real question I want to ask you as I'm reading your book. Is Castro love bombing Khrushchev? Is that what's going on here? Because it sure feels like when he's just like, the question of the bomb, should it be used? And Castro is saying, we'll sacrifice ourselves. And I'm kind of wondering if some farmer outside of Havana is going, what, wait, what's this dynamic about between Castro and Khrushchev? Is there a friendship here? Is this like where he knows that Cuba is dependent upon the Soviet Union? Like, what's going on between these two guys?
Yeah, it's complicated. Yeah. To quote another common term these days, it's complicated. Their status is complicated. And so I think before the missile crisis, they did consider each other friends. They had a very famous hug at the United Nations where they were both there representing their countries. And I think Khrushchev had been really inspired by the Cuban Revolution, and he felt like he was like an older brother to the Cubans, um, and so this crisis really damaged that relationship. During the crisis, there were a lot of Cubans who were echoing Castro, saying we're ready to sacrifice ourselves. They weren't thinking so much in terms of nuclear war. They were more worried about air raids or an invasion. That's what they were defending against. But you found all these quotes from Cubans saying like, we're going to defend our country, patria o muerte. But then I also found other ones that were like, I don't know. Like there's a very famous Cuban film, Memories of Underdevelopment, and its climax is with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it's from the perspective of this kind of alienated bourgeois intellectual guy. It's semi-autobiographical. I interviewed the author about it, um, and he remembers, and his character is talking about like, I'm not ready to sacrifice myself for the Cuban Revolution, and these people don't know what they're talking about. Like we're talking about atomic war, and they're still stuck like 30 years ago. They don't know what atomic war is. And I found other people who also were like, I don't want to sacrifice myself. But the general narrative in Cuba was, this very patriotic sense for defending the homeland. And then when Castro agrees to remove the missiles without consulting Castro, when Khrushchev removes the missiles without consulting Castro, without even like telling him before he announces it, the least he could do would inform him. Castro finds about it out through the radio instead of from his ally. It really damages their relationship, and Castro feels, betrayed, and the Cubans feel betrayed and abandoned, and they're still economically dependent on the Soviet Union. They're still dependent on the Soviet Union for security guarantees as well, and so they have to kind of temper that anger and that resentment, but it's still there for decades afterward. And so this is really a turning point in Soviet-Cuban relations. They never become as close as they were before the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah, this is one of those fast. I have to imagine. Am I wrong here or not? This feels like the height of the Cold War. Mm-hmm. And I have to ask you, as someone who's been studying the Cold War for the longest time, is this the closest we come? How close do we come to an actual war? Is this film dramatizing the event? Or were we that close?
We were close. We were very close. And there's things that they don't even show in the movie that I don't talk about in my book, like when we were
Please, I'd love to hear.
Depth charges on a Soviet submarine, and it was a nuclear armed submarine, which we did not know at the time.
Oh dear.
Yeah. And there were so many moments during the missile crisis when we came so close to nuclear war, either through miscommunication or miscalculation. When the Cubans convinced the Soviets to shoot down a US U-2 plane, they do show that in the movie. Mm-hmm. And that was a really important moment where, Kennedy, they don't know what happened in Cuba. They just know their plane went down. And so they think this is direct Soviet escalation, intentional. And they think it's, the beginning of them getting ready to shoot off their missiles. And what are you going to do if that's happening? Well, you have to strike first. But the fact that they didn't it was very close. Like they were discussing in those meetings, like, we need to respond. They had already said, if someone gets shot down, we are going to go in with our airplanes and our bombs. And the fact that they decided not to was really important in eventually resolving the crisis. But they were very close to responding with an airstrike, which would have killed Soviet soldiers. And then, Khrushchev would have had to respond. And so there was so many moments that we really could have ended up in nuclear war. And it's kind of a miracle that we didn't.
Yeah, because we also hear the city Berlin is like, there's this other thing that's kind of hanging out. It's like, if Havana, if this happens here, the next move is to go against Berlin, and mm-hmm. then everybody's back in this, right?
Yeah.
The letters that Kennedy receives from Khrushchev. When I watch this, I'm like, they get the first letter and then the second letter, and it's just, I'm telling you, I've got the hairs standing up on my arms just thinking about, how do you read this? And these guys are like, is Khrushchev getting replaced? Does he have to appeal to these hard letters? Nobody trusts anybody.
No. And the communication back then was so limited and so indirect that it took forever to get answers about anything. But those letters are really fascinating. Like, you really get such insight into Khrushchev's mindset, especially in the October 26th letter, where he's kind of like spinning out and he's really worried about nuclear war. And he's talking about, like, let's not tie the knot so tightly and pull it so that we can't undo it. And he's talking about the costs of war. Like, you and I both know the costs of war. And so I think it's one of the closest looks we have into what's going on the Soviet side. And for people in the XCOM, it was one of the clearest. But then with the second message, they're like, do we not trust what he said in the previous one? And so, yeah, you get a sense of like of what people were thinking, but also how confused they were, and with good reason.
Do we get because unfortunately we don't get to see Khrushchev, and I'd be fascinated to see this movie made from the Soviet perspective.
Oh yeah,
right. And I'm sure I'm assuming that they probably made films on this, and so forth. But like, you know, Khrushchev comes off so hard initially, and then has this rapid. I mean, it seems like he just changes on a dime here when it comes to that first letter. And I wonder, Renata, is it a case of like Khrushchev was just kind of blustering his way, thinking he was going to push Kennedy the whole time after Pay of Pigs, and realizes, wait a second, the Americans aren't messing around here. This is a different version of Kennedy. Like, what causes this first letter where he's clearly all over the place? He says he's very emotional. Do we get a sense of like, was there a moment for him like that made him kind of stop in his tracks and rethink what they're doing?
I think there were various moments. I think there was a lot of wishful thinking on his part in terms of believing that they could hide the buildup of the missile sites and then just announce like a fait accompli, like, oh, hey, by the way, we now have nuclear
Those
missiles.
aren't palm trees.
Yeah. So, and the Cubans had warned him, and they had said, like, can't hide this. Like, we're 90 miles from the United States. They're going to find out. But he ignored that because he wanted to, and because he wanted it to be true that he could hide it. And so I think once he realized that wasn't the case, it was kind of this like kind of come to Jesus moment for him. He's like, oh no, like now I do have to change my plans. And so he was just scrambling, I think, for a lot of that week. And I think that's after scrambling for days. I think that's the October 26th letter where he's like, this is not going my way. We need to just wrap this up. And then they really expected something to come the night of the 26th. Like the Cubans and the Soviets thought that either the night of the 26th, something was going to happen. And then when it didn't, he kind of like, oh, well, maybe
we get out of this
more, you know, maybe it's not so dire. Maybe we can get something out of this situation. Like we can kind of salvage it. And so I think that accounts for his decision to change the message on the 27th. And then the 27th, like that's people who study the missile crisis call it Black Saturday, because that's when like shit hits the fan in so many ways. And by the end of that day, he's like, no, this is not. And so then by the 28th, that's when he sends a message saying, we're going to remove the missiles. But he does go through a lot of these, like he's very volatile. Like people are always talking about how emotional Castro is. But I would say also Khrushchev.
I wouldn't blame any of these three guys for being emotional. I mean, it's like quite literally on the edge of like the thermonuclear war, right? That we've terrified.
And we should be emotional about that.
Yeah. I have a question here though, because what happens here, like we get the final thing. Okay, it's over. We've made, and I love how they show the back channel deals, stuff like that. It's so cool. It feels like one of these classic, 70s films and so forth. The three guys are kind of out there walking out, outside the White House, but we don't see what happens next. Like you and I know that, Cold War is going to continue on for decades, and someone could argue that we're still in it. But what happens, Renata, in Latin America? Can we talk a little about what happens after the hostilities are over for the day? What happens next? Like you talk about all these different countries, things like that, how they were watching or reacting. What's the effect on like democracy, republics, foreign policy in Central and South America and Latin America writ large?
Yeah, that's
you have 6 hours to respond.
Yeah, yes. I know, right? That's the whole third section of my book, the last section. But I found a lot of consequences of the Cuban Missile Crisis that we hadn't really thought about. And so I think initially, like in the United States, most Latin Americans were like, whew, that was a close one. Thank God we didn't end up in nuclear war. But that initial sense of relief was very quickly replaced for a lot of people by disappointment. And especially on the part of Cuban exiles, the leaders of countries in Central America, they had seen the missile crisis as their best chance to remove Castro. And they said, if not now, then when? Like, he has gone beyond the pale. He has introduced nuclear weapons that endangered everyone on the planet. How could we possibly tolerate him now? Like, this is the time when we're all going to act together and get rid of Castro and free Cuba. And they didn't, and then Kennedy promises not to. And they feel betrayed too, just like Castro felt betrayed by Khrushchev. Like, all of these people who are hoping to oust Castro felt really betrayed by Kennedy for not taking advantage of the best opportunity that he had to get rid of Castro. And so you do get, and that lasts, like that disappointment. They're bitter.
Well, can I ask a question here, which is, we know that like the United States takes these multiple chances that this exploding cigar. We hear all these stories, right?
Mm-hmm.
Was there never a movement on a part of any of these Latin American countries to remove Castro themselves? Like Venezuela never says, nah, we're done with this guy. Or, is there just a fear of American reprisals, Soviet reprisals? Like, I can't imagine that like there aren't any countries in Central South America that don't have militaries or capabilities to do this stuff. Why don't they make a move against Castro on their own if they don't like him that much?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And some of them say, we'll do it ourselves. So like Nicaragua's leader, Somoza, says, we don't need the United States. We're going to remove him ourselves. But then he doesn't.
Right.
And they try to like drum up support in the Organization of American States for more multilateral action. They eventually do get all of the countries in the Americas, except for Mexico, to cut relations with Cuba. And there was a history of like inter-American coordination, like assassination. Aaron Coy Moulton has really interesting work on this, on kind of transnational organizing to assassinate people and to overthrow governments. And so there is a history of that. But they don't have any real success after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the Missile Crisis is like the height of inter-American cooperation against Castro. And it kind of declines after that, especially once the United States is like, we're not going to invade again. They're still, they still have the, like cutting off Cuba from trade. They still have all the multilateral stuff, but they're not going to invade Cuba again after the Missile Crisis. And so, yeah, but that's a good question. Like, why didn't they just do that themselves? But Cuban security was good. Like their intelligence services were good. They were on top of all of those efforts. Security was tight in Cuba. So it's not that easy to go into Havana and kill Castro.
Living in South Florida as long as I did, I have a lot of friends who are Cuban or of Cuban descent. I was kind of posting last night. One of the reasons I love your book so much is like I have a real love affair with Cuban history. It's just kind of always been a thing for me. And I guess the question I've got for you is, as a scholar of the Cold War, its lingering effects, things like that, the United States and Cuba still have never gotten right with each other. I don't know how to say this. Maybe that's the best way to put it across. How much of that do you get a sense that the missile crisis has a lingering effect in relations all the way to today, or is it something else? Like, I kind of wondering, where does the Cuban Missile Crisis play now into relations, say, between the United States and Cuba itself?
I think it does still play a role. Like, we are still, even under Trump, not really talking about actively invading Cuba. And there were efforts after the missile crisis. There's a really good book by Peter Kornbluh and William Leogrand, Back Channel to Cuba, about this long history of efforts to improve relations. But it's always secret, like it's back channel, like the title says. So there were efforts, especially after the missile crisis. Kennedy was interested in kind of improving that relationship to a certain extent. But it's remarkable that it is still such a poisonous relationship, and that they weren't able to kind of build on this opportunity. Just like the exiles are like, this is your opportunity to get rid of Castro. Other people are like, this is an opportunity to maybe step back and reevaluate our policies, and yet we haven't. We have tried, but it's remarkable, just the kind of staying power of the Castro regime in Cuba, and their like resilience of U.S. hostility and refusal to really engage with the Cuban government.
Yeah, it's we should probably point out, it's worth pointing out that our Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, is of Cuban descent.
Mhm. Yeah,
Ted Cruz, I believe his father's Cuban. Is that correct?
I think so.
It's like we've got, frankly, Cuban Americans in very high
Mhm.
places within the government now. And I felt that during the Obama administration, things were starting to warm, and there's a chance
Mhm.
that I would get to go to Cuba.
I
I
know.
am dying to go. My friends who are listening to this, who know me, just know my love of the island and the people. Um, yeah, it's a frustrating thing that it hurt. It's strange for me. Renata is a guy who's not Cuban. I'm not
Mhm.
Hispanic. My ancestors were all from England, who has never colonized anything ever. But
Completely innocent.
it hurts my heart to see people this close, especially knowing the communities I
Mhm.
have that were separated from families,
Yeah.
things like that. And I'm like, why does this still exist in
Mhm.
2025? Um, I want to ask you a final question, but not about history. I want to ask you about the future. Um, you've now published 2 books. What happens next for you? Have you started? Are you one of these people that has already got your 3rd project? You're one of those people. Oh my
I
gosh,
am one of those
I can't
people.
do that. My brain doesn't operate that way. Like, what comes next for you? Are you currently working on it now? Like, what are you doing?
I am. I am one of those people who I always like to have something to work on. And when I was writing my first book, I started teaching this class on drugs and security in the Americas, and I was looking for information because I didn't know much about the topic at the time. And I came across this Cuban American who became a major drug trafficker in Mexico. And I was writing a book about Mexico and Cuba, and I was like, huh, interesting. Noted.
How about
Started a
that?
little file on my computer.
Of
And
course you
then
did.
just whenever I came across him, his name is Alberto Cecilia Falcone, I would
That's a
add stuff.
great name.
I know, yeah.
Yeah,
It's hard to figure out sometimes because some people refer to him by Cecilia, some people say
sure.
Falcone. I've asked people who worked with him, I get different answers. But so I've just been collecting stuff just on the side, whenever I haven't been focusing on it because I've
Mhm.
been focusing on these other 2 books. Um, but I'm ready. I did a little research on him last spring when I went to Mexico. I found some cool stuff in the archives there. I went to DC this summer and found some more. And so I want this to be like a biography of Alberto Cecilia Falcone, and looking at this transition from Cold War to drug war, since he was like a product of the Cuban Revolution. He worked with the CIA for a while and like attacking Cuba and helping exile like efforts to unseat Castro, and then became the guy who connected Mexico to Colombia in terms of trafficking Colombian cocaine. And so he's such a fascinating person. And I think it's a really great story about the connections between these 2 major conflicts we've had in the hemisphere. And I kind of want to write it as a trade press book. I'm putting that wish out into the world now.
Oh, you kidding
Because
me? Like, I'm wanting to, like, I'm already envisioning like the 5th season of Narcos
yes,
starting
he's
like
in
around this
Narcos
guy.
Mexico. He is. He's a minor character in Narcos Mexico.
Oh, is he
They
really?
don't get his story right.
Okay.
It's not
All right.
accurate when
Okay.
it comes
Well,
to him.
well,
Um,
this is our chance to fix it. By this time,
yeah,
the movie side of
mhm.
HATL will be up and going. Like,
Yeah.
as soon as you write this thing, that sounds like so much fun.
Yeah,
So
it has been fun. It's different, right? I haven't written about drugs very much before, so it is like a different
no, it's a different
area
vibe,
to
right? Like
explore. Yeah.
maybe kind of different audience, different kind of
Mhm.
story. Like as a historian, we're always thinking about like, it's like playing the same song over and over again. You want to create something new and different and have fun with it. That's
Yeah.
taught to my students. Like when I was teaching, I was like, this is supposed to be fun. go have fun with this, right?
I know.
So,
I was telling a student today, she's like, I don't know how to come up with research questions. And I was saying, well, what do you like? What do you like to read? Do that.
Yeah, this doesn't have to be, there's nothing saying we can't have fun doing this. So, yeah. Well, speaking of that, this has been fun. Thank you so much. Come back on the pod to talk about other things. We'll do your first book. I don't care. Like, let's just pick a movie or whatever. Let's go. I'm in. So thank you so much for being here. This has been amazing.
Thank you. No, this is so much fun. I really appreciate the opportunity, and it's nice to get to know you a little bit more.
It's been great. So everybody who's been listening in, we'll put links to this on the pod. But the book is The Fate of the Americas, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Hemispheric Cold War. God, nobody makes a cover like UNC Press.
I know.
Right?
Gorgeous.
They are so good. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon, evening,
whatever.
Day. Yeah. I'll see you around.
And that's a wrap here at Reckoning with Jason Herbert. Thank you so very much to our guest, Dr. Renata Keller. Renata, you are amazing. This was so much fun. Thank you so very, very much. Thank you, of course, to our producer, Fletcher Powell, for making this show run. And thank you to all of you for continuing to listen in, for sharing these podcasts with your friends and everyone else. If there are episodes you want to listen to, hit me up. Tell me what films you want to have on the pod, and we will get those going here. We have so many new podcasts coming out for you in season 3 here on Reckoning. I can't tell you how excited I am for you to listen to all of them. Thank you so much for being here, and we will catch you next time. Ciao for now. Bye.